Thank you, Susan. Thank you for inviting me. These bits are so important. I'm sorry about this order. I should have gone first. These two are difficult act to follow here. A veteran, Vietnam veteran, after some 30 years or so, walks into a VA and meets with one intake person. And the person asks the veteran, are you a Vietnam veteran? So the guy thoughtfully says, yeah, I am. So as per procedure, I guess, the intake clinician asks, when were you there? The veteran thinks about it and says, last night. Wars like that. Wars like that. Before I go into what I talked about, want to talk about, let me just say a couple of things. I teach a course called The Mythology of War at SVA. And for whatever the reason, it registers up all the time. And it's an art college, so that's an accomplishment for a humanities department course, especially one that deals with such an unfortunate topic as war. It registers up. But it did. And I've been doing it for a number of years now, maybe 10, 12 years. But not long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, I get an email and said, hi Mac, you might not remember me, but my name is Richie, and I took your Mythology of War class, and now I'm in Iraq with the Marines. So I said to myself, oh my God, what the freak did I do wrong here? And then this kid went out and believe me, we have to be careful, because that's why I'm not a big fan of memoirs and things like that, because inevitably, though we try to be realistic and tell the truth about the experience and about what war is really about, we inevitably mythologize it, whether we want to or not. It's glory, it's nobility, it's heroism. And we feed into that. Why? Because we'd rather think of ourselves as heroes than dupes. So we seek cover under that mythology of heroism. So I worried, I questioned myself, did I not make clear how this horror, what it's like, what it does to humanity? So he says to me in the email, Mac, I remember our course and our discussions, and I think so often about it. And now that I'm here, I really need to talk with someone about what I'm going through, but I can't. I don't feel comfortable talking to anyone here. Would you mind if we communicate with the email, you and I? So I said, no, not at all. So we began this email correspondence about what he was feeling and what he was doing, and we talked about so many things. We talked about conscientious objection, and he was actually in the Navy, but volunteered. The Marine Corps doesn't have their own medics, their own corpsmen. We take our corpsmen from the Navy. So he was actually in the Navy, but serving with the Marines as a corpsman. So I said, well, can't you go back to the Navy? He thought about it, and then he said, no, I can't go back because I can't leave these guys. I'll be deserting them. And that's part of the trick. That's part of the trick that keeps us there. That keeps us coming back. So I said, well, how much more time do you have in country? He said, oh, only a couple of more weeks, I can survive. So he before we can talk in detail about conscientious objection, he tells me he just went to see the chaplain. And the first question the chaplain asked him was, well, are you against all war? So now he thought about it. He said, no, I'm not against all war, but I just can't content is my conscience doesn't let me accept this one, because I don't see the morality, the purpose of all of this. Well, the chaplain answers, of course, that, conscientious objection is out, because we only recognize general conscientious objection, not selective conscientious objection. So if you are against all wars, and you can prove your pacifism, then maybe they would consider you for conscientious objection. And many veterans have received conscientious objection discharges by proving a crystallization of conscience. Because after all, we have a whole volunteer army now. So when you joined the army, what did you think you were going to be doing? Didn't you realize you're going to be killing people? So of course you must have at some point accepted the fact that you were going to be doing killing, and yet you were okay with it then. Well, what happened along the way that changed your mind? So you have to kind of come up with some justification. Many people have very legitimate ones. So being that he was only against this service, this war, he wasn't able to get. So he survived the last 2 weeks, came home with his unit, and was stationed for a while, I think, in the West Coast. So we kept communicating, and he knew that his rotation, he was going to be deployed again, I think this time to Afghanistan, in a couple of months. And he didn't really feel like he could go back. So we had this dilemma of conscious conflict of conscience. I can't do it. I can't go back there and be part of this. Now, he didn't have a gun. He was out there killing people. He was out there helping people. And that may be even more difficult to deal with, because he feels that he's required there to save his brothers and sisters' lives. And how could he leave them because of his moral concerns? So it just so happened that when his unit was going back to Afghanistan, they were going to have a forward and a rear. And the forward unit was getting on the plane, going to Afghanistan. The rear was going to stay in California, and he was able to stay with the rear. So what happened? Well, he goes to the airport, watches all his brothers and sisters getting on the plane, going off to Afghanistan, while he stood there watching. His job in the rear was to process the injured and the dead coming home from Iraq. So he stood there with a clipboard and took the names of his dead brothers and sisters and injured brothers and sisters who were coming home from Afghanistan. Needless to say, he didn't know what to do with this. He felt overwhelmed. Now, it was on the West Coast, so I contacted Richie's father, and Richie wasn't really talking to them about anything, so I tried to maybe meet up if he was coming back to the East Coast, but he wasn't. And then all of a sudden I didn't hear from Richie anymore, and I contacted his father, and his father said, well, he's okay. So I said, I just don't understand why I'm not hearing from him. So maybe he, I guess I comfort myself thinking that, well, maybe he found a resolution to his issues. And I hope that's the case. I actually never heard from Richie again. But that's moral injury. That's moral injury. And I really think, Beth had mentioned that they separate, that what they do is not combat what therapy? It's grief therapy. Well, yeah, but you know what? That grief, we call it moral injury. And the injury is based upon our experiences where? In combat, in war. So it is a combat injury. And until we recognize that, and until we stop treating it as some sort of... When I first started writing about moral injuries, back in the late 70s, early 80s, I had a paper that I thought really addressed some of the concerns that we needed to have about moral injury, and I took it to Dr. Stein. Anybody know Dr. Stein? No? Dr. Stein he was the head of psychiatry at Brooklyn Veterans Administration. And I took it to him and let him read it. He said, yeah, it's okay, it's interesting, he said, but he was a Freudian, and then he tells me that, yeah, it's all wonderful, but moral issues, moral concerns are clinically irrelevant. And that was the mindset. No social work or psychological magazine or journal would publish it. It was eventually published in a philosophical journal. And that's where it stayed. But I think I really am happy that we have now conferences like this, where we can, these issues, yeah, you guys ought to be recorded, and we thank you for that. It took you long enough. But you came around. Maybe we weren't yelling loud enough. So we're going to try, with my sister, we're going to try and yell even louder. And we yelled. Yeah. Anyway. Let me just, look, I have a kind of a weird situation that I consider myself both the observer and the observed. I shift back and forth from the veteran who has experienced war to the philosopher who studies war and morality theoretically. This has been great. This has been helpful for my research, as I need only to introspect to find the observations and the feelings and the pain that ultimately informs my philosophical inquiry. It's also confusing, as you can imagine, as I often feel somewhat schizophrenic, jumping back and forth from one personality to the other. And as usual, when I'm asked to speak at a conference like this, I am never sure who you will hear from. Will you hear from the war veteran, or will you hear from the philosopher? The philosopher, he speaks from the mind, the warrior from where it hurts. As usual, after some internal debate, we decided that you will hear from us both. A.A. Milne was a veteran of the Battle of Somme, and some 1 million human beings were killed in that battle. It's arguably one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in the bloody history of humankind. You may know A.A. Milne. What did I do? Because not only is he a war veteran, but he's also the author of the Pooh Tales, Winnie the Pooh. Now you're going to be looking differently at Winnie the Pooh once you have this knowledge, because Winnie the Pooh is not about some lonely little bear, some kid. It's about his moral injury and his post-traumatic stress disorder. And as you re-look now, with that in mind, you will see it. You will see it. It seems impossible to me now, he says, that any sensitive man or woman could live through another war if not required to die in other ways. He would waste away from soul sickness. Though the military has given lip service to the prevalence, severity, and debilitating effects of psychological, emotional, and moral injury, what I term PEM, P-E-M, injuries, and the importance of screening and treating veterans for its occurrence. Now, given the military's culture of physical and mental toughness, these invisible wounds of war are rarely taken seriously enough, or ignored completely, or stigmatized as mental illness. Further, until rather recently, as we've made clear, the mainstream therapeutic community has neither recognized nor adequately addressed the prevalence and severity of moral injury. Tragically, mental health professionals understand implicitly, in the military, understand implicitly that their function is to cure the soldier quickly, or more likely, to mask her symptoms with medication and return her to the fighting. Now, if the appreciation and gratitude that we hear so often from politicians and citizens to members of the military and veterans, if that expression of gratitude is more than mere rhetoric, if this nation sincerely intends to fulfill its contractual and moral obligation to those who served and sacrificed so much, if their injuries are to be taken seriously and their needs met, the military and the Veterans Administration must go beyond lip service and pretense and implement a treatment program that includes but goes beyond PTSD, that is, beyond traumatic stress, and deals with the emotional, the impact on one's moral character and integrity, moral injury. Morality provides the parameters of our being, what I term our moral identity. It is moral values and norms influence, if not dictate, how we define ourselves as persons, how we structure our world, and render our relationship to it and to other human beings comprehensible. Morals are personal and shared familial, cultural, societal, and legal rules for social behavior. Fundamental assumptions about how things should work and how one should behave in the world. This is my philosophical leanings here. One critical moral conviction foundational to any reasonable normative ethical system and to the moral identity of most rational human beings is, or ought to be, respect for persons. Inherent in this moral principle is the recognition that all human beings, at least, possess unconditional moral value and consequently must be treated as ends in themselves and not only as the means to the ends of other human beings or nations. That is, that all persons, all human beings have intrinsic moral value, not instrumental value only. If we do not respect and value persons, then respect for anything else that we pledge to hold sacred, whether it be property or country or flag, loses all meaning. This principle of respect for person is manifest as maintaining that all human beings have inalienable human rights, and correlative to these rights are the obligations that all moral agents have to respect and not to violate them. It is clear to me as well that adhering to this rule, this principle as foundational, will bring the greatest balance of good, benefit over evil, detriment of harm into the world for the greatest number of people. So in a sense then, this principle is not only Kantian or deontological, but it is rule utilitarian for you philosophers out there as well. Consequently, we now have the means and we have the need to weigh concrete situations in order to determine acceptable right and unacceptable wrong behavior and to act accordingly. Moral concerns become clinically relevant because combat behavior negatively impacts, violates the warrior's moral foundations. Participation in war, displacing civilians, torturing, injuring, killing other human beings, damages self-esteem, self-image, integrity, and precipitates debilitating remorse, guilt, shame, disorientation, and alienation from the remainder of the moral community. This is moral injury. The veteran speaks. In a poem entitled Warrior's Dance, Tai Chi, I offer a poetic description of my state of mind at one point in my military service in Vietnam. I fear I am no longer alien to this horror. I am the horror. I have lost my humanity and have embraced the insanity of war, the monster, and I are one. So I dance, the dance of warriors. Amidst decaying corpses and forsaken loved ones, I dance. I have feasted upon their flesh, and with their blood have quenched my thirst. The blood of innocence forever stains my soul. The transformation is complete, and I can never return. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I think this poetic expression of a warrior's perception of self is common to many who share the experience. It suggests a recognition of the horrors associated with war, a somewhat stoic dismay at having embraced the mythological warrior identity, an awareness of having transgressed a more deeply seated sense of self, a perceived culpability for my actions, and an acceptance of the consequent sanctions for my crimes. Also indicated is the abandonment, the isolation and alienation from the remainder of the moral community many warriors suffer following their return to a society in which killing is murder and cruelty, brutality, and violence, the behavioral characteristics and values appropriate to the warrior identity are unacceptable. And the veteran speaks. Upon my return to the world, the United States, I felt a stranger in my own home. Things were different, or maybe I was different. As much as I hated the war, at least there I felt I belonged. I knew what was expected of me, and after some 13 months in country, I was able to fill those expectations. Here, I am a misfit, an aberration, isolated and alone. So whether we act rightly or wrongly, according to or in violation of our moral identity, this will affect whether we perceive ourselves as true to our personal convictions and to others who share our values and our ideals. Moral injuries are, in most cases, an inevitable consequence of the sophisticated manipulation and distortion during basic training of the recruits' moral foundations, their moral identities, and subsequently the profound confusion and distress they experience as the horror and insanity, the reality of the battlefield becomes apparent, and they are confronted by the realization of the moral gravity of their actions in combat. And the veteran speaks. I remember once, in another lifetime, noticing a lone rose rising defiantly from beneath the rubble outside a destroyed city north of Da Nang. It had no business being there, adding color to the drabness of war, beauty to the ugliness of destruction, and the hope of life when life held nothing but suffering and death. It was a contradiction and created confusion amidst the clarity of killing to survive. I stepped on it. There are no flowers in a war zone, no color, no beauty, no hope.